We turn now to ownership of inputs and outputs from AI systems, to intellectual property rights in inputs and outputs. So we're going to talk about when and to what extent the customer, who's usually the one who wants it, owns the outputs. Or does the vendor have some ownership, as well as what happens to intellectual property rights in the prompts and other inputs that the customer puts in. But before we get specifically into that, we need to look at two problems in the law that kind of hang over all this that make discussions of ownership problematic at best. So one is if the inputs or outputs contain data, and you could say inputs and outputs contain, sometimes they contain images and stuff like that. Yes, but let's just look at the part of them that are information that comes out, suggestions, ideas, numbers, etc. Can you actually own that? A lot of people get offended when I say, no, you really can't in any meaningful way. What do I mean by that? You can't have a patent in data. You can't have a patent in information. You need a real invention to have a patent. So that form of IP is out the window when it comes to data in your inputs or outputs. You also, in general, can't have a copyright in data. A copyright is a right to a work of authorship that you write or paint or photograph or sculpt or whatever it might be. With data, you just collected it. You didn't write it. So right off the bat, copyright doesn't really apply. Also, copyright, it needs to be an asset with some creativity to it. It can't be just pure information. So again, data is by definition just pure information. So copyright doesn't apply. Maybe you have some trade secrets in your data, but you don't really own information under a trade secret. What you really have is this sort of limited negative right to block people who've misappropriated the information from you from reusing it. If they got it, inappropriately from you, they can be blocked from using it if it's a trade secret. That doesn't mean you own the information. If somebody independently writes source code, for instance, that does the same as yours and yours is a trade secret, if they didn't get it from you, you got nothing. You don't really own that information. So there's no obvious way in which it means anything to say that you own your data. And actually, this isn't anything unique to AI. I raise this issue in all cloud deals, all deals where we're talking about ownership and control of data. The reality is ownership is a weak and low value concept when you talk about information, when you talk about data, including in AI and the outputs and inputs. That's not to say I'm recommending that if you're trying to claim the data that you ignore ownership. There is language that I recommend here in blue in this middle column to claim ownership to the best that you can. What you need to recognize, though, is that you may be achieving very little and possibly nothing because ownership is such a bad concept when it comes to data. So with this language here, I do recommend if you're claiming ownership of data in outputs and inputs, you say the data is your valuable property. You say it includes your trade secrets. You probably aren't going to get away with saying your whole data set's a trade secret, maybe, but at least it includes it. You also can go after a sort of weak form of copyright in your data. I said you can't, you don't write your data, so you don't own it. You actually can get a compilation copyright in data that you collect, even if you didn't write it. And that's information, even if it's not truly creative output. It's a weak form of copyright. And it's also not as useful as you might think. It's, no copyright is likely to keep your vendor, for instance, from mining your data if they already have a copy. It would keep them from reproducing it. So it's not wildly valuable, but it is at least worth trying to claim a compilation copyright in the data in your inputs and outputs. And so you've got this language here. By the way, all this language is available to you at techcontracts.com, including in that article I mentioned, the AI contracts issue spotter. But you say the data is an original compilation under copyright law, that's C, and you say D, customer or whoever is supposed to own it has dedicated substantial resources to collecting, managing it, and compiling it. That's the best you can do, I think, about claiming ownership of the data. Recognize that you haven't achieved all that much. And in fact, you'll get much more bang for your buck talking about control over data, which is a separate topic we'll talk about. But for a moment, we're just looking at ownership terms. So claim it, recognize it's pretty weak. Problem number two with claiming ownership, IP, in outputs or inputs. Actually, this is particularly a problem with outputs. Here, we're not just talking about the data in the output. We're talking, let's say the Gen AI system produces real content like source code or a photograph or an image, text that's going to be used for some situation where if it had been written by a human, it would be subject to copyright. It's not pure data. You still have an IP problem in it. And the problem has to do with this photo here on the screen. This is the famous monkey selfie. This is a picture that a monkey took of himself. And of course, there was a copyright battle over who owns the copyright in the first photograph ever taken by a monkey, maybe even by a non-human. And the outcome in the courts was nobody owns it because copyright requires a human author. And the monkey wasn't a human. Nobody owns the monkey selfie. Well, same applies to outputs, photographs, software code, whatever it might be, generated by a computer. Outputs from an artificial intelligence system. Nobody owns that either. At least as the law currently stands, no one has a copyright in the content created by the computer because it's not a human author. Also, no one can get a patent in an invention created by a computer because, again, it isn't a human author. None of that is a problem, by the way, for trademark and trade secret. You can have trademark and trade secrets in something generated by AI because they're established in different ways. It's not about who invented it, who wrote it. It's about using it in commerce in the case of trade secret, or it's about keeping it confidential and it having commercial value in the case of, in the case of trade secret, use in commerce in the case of trademark. So it's not an issue there. But with copyright and patent, which is probably what you're looking for, you can't own it. Now, that's not entirely true. If there's human input into the output, if a human, for instance, creates software and the AI edits it, there can be a copyright because of the human created original. Or if a human invents something and the AI modifies it, there can still be a patent in it. The line between human contribution and AI contribution isn't clear. To what extent the AI's role invalidates any chance to have a copyright or a patent. There's questions about what if the human wrote lots and lots of creative prompts and that led to answered legal questions. But what's pretty clear under multiple jurisdictions around the world, particularly in the United States, is the part purely created by the computer, no one can own. And that's a problem when we're talking about customers getting rights to their AI outputs from vendors. Why? Because the vendor, all it has to contribute in most cases is the computer. Any human involved in the process worked for the customer. It's the customer staff putting in prompts, uploading their own creative stuff. The vendor's not providing people, it's just providing the one part of the creative effort that we know can't generate any IP. So that's problem number two. One is we can't own, in a meaningful sense, the data in the inputs and outputs. And two is we can't own anything in the purely computer-created part of the outputs. So what do we do with all this? What do we do with terms on ownership of inputs and outputs? Let's start with the outputs. The good news is the parties probably don't really disagree on all this. The provider probably doesn't want to own the outputs from its system, the outputs that the customer staff generated, and the customer does. And so we're mostly on the same page. There are a few complications. We just talked about the fact that the provider may actually have no IP to contribute in the computer-generated part of the outputs, either because it's data and there's nothing to own, or because it's content generated by a computer. There's a couple other issues sort of limiting the provider's mobility. One is there may be plenty of third-party intellectual property rights buried invisibly in the outputs. The training data used to create the system could have had third-party IP in it, almost certainly did in a large language model or other foundation model. And that could come out in outputs. And the customer could put third-party stuff into the inputs, into the prompts, which could come out in outputs. And then it's also possible, not very likely maybe, but it's possible that the provider's own content could end up in the outputs because the customer, because some of it was in the training data, or because the customer took some stuff from the provider's documentation and pasted it into a prompt. So all in all, the provider is fine with the customer owning it, but should be a little bit careful. For instance, a typical contract clause might say the provider acknowledges that the customer owns the outputs, but has some NDA type carve-outs. I call them NDA type carve-outs because it's roughly the same language you see in a non-disclosure agreement. And by the way, this language is available to you. Samples are available to you at techcontracts.com. An NDA usually says, the information's confidential, but not information we independently developed or got from a third-party source, something like that. You'd want to say roughly the same thing if you're the provider and you're acknowledging customer ownership of outputs. You want to make sure that just in case your own stuff is in there, you're not agreeing that they own that. The flip side for the customer is it's probably a good idea to say that if that stuff owned by the vendor got in there, somehow or other from the prompt or the training data that some vendor-owned stuff is in the output, that they license it to you. They give you a broad license to reproduce, distribute, modify, publicly perform, publicly display, whatever they may own that comes out in the outputs. All well and good, and that should be, reasonably acceptable. Some providers might be a little more cautious and say that they're not even going to acknowledge ownership. They're just going to say, we don't contest customers' claim of ownership. It's actually a little safer for the provider. You don't really know who owns the stuff. We're just not contesting their claim, and we're not claiming it. We're not claiming ownership of the outputs. If you're on the customer side, that actually might be just fine. You might still want that license to anything that the provider does own, but keep in mind the provider, the stuff that's truly new, content truly generated by the system, the provider has no rights to give you anyway. On the flip side, the customer might get the provider to go all the way in the other direction and assign all of its rights to the outputs. Again, if you're the provider, it's not the end of the world, but I would again have those NDA type carve-outs so that you're not giving away stuff that, was truly yours before and ended up in a prompt or somehow otherwise, some other way in the output. But not necessarily wildly complicated terms on ownership of outputs. Once you recognize again what a limited low-value concept ownership is. And when you finish with all this work about outputs ownership, I'm going to recommend that you move on to contract terms about control of outputs, which will give you more bang for your buck. Possibly even simpler terms when you're talking about ownership of inputs. Customer, yes, you should definitely claim that you own the inputs put in by your people. Recognize again that the vendor's agreement to that isn't necessarily a wildly valuable clause, because if the inputs were data, you might not really own it. It's not meaningful. And it doesn't necessarily block the vendor from doing things like data mining. So again, you should focus on control. But if you can get the other party to agree that you own your own inputs, that's great. Vendors, again, it's always better to not contest someone's claim of ownership of IP than to actually acknowledge it, and certainly better than to assign it. If you can just say something like, vendor makes no claim of ownership of inputs. Vendor makes no claim that this agreement transfers ownership rights to inputs to vendor. That should be enough. And if you're on the customer side, that's probably enough if you can't get them to agree to actual ownership terms. So again, inputs are not necessarily very heavily contested. You just need to understand the weaknesses in talking about intellectual property. Again, once you're done claiming ownership, allocating ownership, dealing with it, move on to what's more important, which is terms about control of inputs. Use the contract to substitute for the weakness of intellectual property and get real limits on use of input through control terms. If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.